So I'm going to start today by thinking about what a buyer persona is. What's the definition of a buyer persona? And there are multiple definitions, and I've chosen just two to share with you here. One which is sort of more research-based, and the other which is more about a sort of fictional representation. So one definition, a research-based archetypal modeled representation of who your buyer is, what they're trying to accomplish, what goals drive their behaviour, how they think, how they buy, and most importantly, really, how they make their buying decisions. So we need to really understand who these people are and what makes them think. Another definition is more of a fictional representation, so a semi-fictional representation of your ideal customer based on real data. And also some selected educated speculation. And I think that's important to bear in mind when we go through this presentation, that actually this is very much a research-based exercise, but we're not forgetting the knowledge that's already held within the organisation. So at Business Advantage, we use a hybrid approach covering various research methods to validate and enhance current understanding, which moves from speculation to confirmation and ends up providing provable, repeatable and actionable information. A buyer persona is very different from a customer profile, and in the past many companies would have done quite detailed customer profiling, but these tend to focus very much on the demographic and firmographic aspects. So they're looking at things like job titles, industry sectors, company size. It's not going very deep. It's giving you more of a picture of that organisation and that customer. Buyer personas are much more about trying to understand customers' internal working models to create visualised, personified characters. And this means getting way beyond the firmographics and the demographics and understanding much more about them. It's about their motivations and goals, both professionally and personally in terms of their pain points, and about getting a deep insight into their behaviours in terms of decision making, but also in terms of workflow processes. Buyer personas initially focus on qualitative research, and this is where you really need to get a really good in-depth understanding that comes from speaking to customers as well as internal people. And then that leads to a quantification process so that you can start to group people and start to use them more effectively. And that's done by using skills analysis, ultimately to join the dots. So why use buyer personas? What's the point of them? Why bother? Buyer personas are created by taking a number of different personas, and this really helps you target your marketing and sales strategy, and perhaps most importantly thinks about the tactics so that you're really speaking to the heart of your customers in their own language. You understand what's important to them and what makes them tick, so that you can actually really address their individual concerns. This results in revenue growth and ultimately customer growth. They now have a clear reason why to buy from you, and you've helped them achieve their goals. This in turn leads to cost reductions because your marketing and sales campaigns can become much more targeted. A couple of examples to illustrate this. So, for example, some people are predominantly motivated by cost. If you understand this, you can focus on how your product and solution will help them reduce their costs. For others, ease of use might be their driver. In that case, it's important to understand what aspects are the most important for them in terms of ease of use. And if you can focus on simplifying their top 5 pain points with regards to usage, you are significantly enhancing their user experience. A final example is getting into the customer's mindset and understanding their current business problems. Then your marketing communications can really address the things that are keeping your customers awake at night. So how do we do all this? Well, typically we would use a multi-staged approach using ethnographics, depth interviews, focus groups and larger scale quantitative research. You may not be using all of those things with every project, but they're the different elements that may or may go into the project. You'll start with list building to ensure that you've got the right respondents to speak to, so you can target the correct people. Ethnographics is a really good way of understanding how people work. So you're not talking about developing questionnaires and scripts, but it's about perhaps a half-day shadowing, observing, and conversation, really, to understand how they work and how they think. The ethnographic element of this will probably be limited to a small number of companies that you will actually go and visit and spend, 2, 3, 4 hours with. You might follow that up with depth interviews, or either with individuals or dyads and triads, where you might speak to 2 or 3 people jointly. You might do that face-to-face or by telephone. And you may go on to do some focus groups where you might be talking to a slightly larger audience, typically of around 8 people. And when you have a really good depth understanding of key issues, that can be developed into a quantitative script so that larger samples can be interviewed, and then these results segmented. This enables the qualitative insights to be distilled down into a workable number of groups or personas with their own unique characteristics. And then that enables you to have marketing messages and campaigns that can be developed to target these specific groups. So who to interview and how many interviews. I mentioned earlier internal respondents. It's really important to speak to your sales team. Your sales team are an invaluable starting point. They already know their customers, so proactively engaging them and using their insights as input is vital. You also need their buy-in in the early stages so that ultimately they'll want to be using the personas that are developed. If they're really engaged at the beginning and they can see the value and they've added their insights, then they're going to work with the results. You obviously are going to speak to your current customers, but prospective or competitive customers also helpful at this stage. When you're talking to prospective or competitive customers, the focus becomes not about you and your solutions, but about them and their challenges and desires. And so non-customers can be very helpful in bringing new perspectives. You can focus on what people actually do rather than what they might do. And at this stage, it's also important to think about different groups of end users. One insight might solve a problem for one group, but actually that may create a problem for another group, and understanding that is vital. The number of interviews varies and is sometimes a function of waiting to see repetition, especially in the early stages when you're doing something like ethnographics. But as you move towards the quantitative phase, you might be typically wanting to look at maybe 30 to 50 respondents per subgroup, but that's going to depend varying on the number of subgroups, geographies, and not to mention timings and budgets. So what to ask? There's a long list here of the areas that you might wish to explore, and this is definitely not intended to be a list of questions. It's more about a range of topics to be covered. And so with general profiles, you would understand the background, and you would do that here too. So personal details like age and education, and company information like size and industry sector. But then you want to understand more about their roles and responsibilities, almost like a day in the life of. Obviously, a lot of that could come from ethnographic work. You want to understand their goals, challenges and successes and how they measure them, and what blocks that. What are the frustrations and pain points? How do they currently address these issues? When it comes to the buying cycle, who is involved? Is it the decision makers, influencers? How do they work together? Who does what? And what are their buying preferences? How and where do they buy? And most importantly, why? What makes the buying process successful? What motivates them? And what are their beliefs and attitudes? So, for example, some people predominantly want email or telephone contact, but others want face-to-face. It's important to get that right. Same about their watering holes. Where do they go for information? Do they want everything electronically, or do they want it through social networks? Or do they still want everything, or not everything, but do they still want some things in terms of a physical document? And recent work we've done has shown some really interesting geographic differences in terms of what people want, with some countries still actually valuing that brochure and others finding it a complete waste of time. Does everything need to be in local language or not? Sometimes English will suffice, sometimes it won't. And how do they prefer to be communicated? What happens when that's done well, and what's the impact if it isn't? And how do they research their suppliers? What influences their behaviour most? So you can see a long list of what would be topics that would be developed over time, so that you would eventually develop that into something that you could actually measure. There's been much research into general buying behaviours, and here's one which classifies people into 4 groups: assertives, analyticals, socials and amiables. These talk about general personas, but they're not linked to your specific business, and so this type of information might be part of the picture, but it's not going to be the whole story. So an assertive might want control and need achievement of measurable goals. Analyticals like detail and data. They'll want every technical spec that you've got going, whereas socials are very influenced by others. So for them, having lots of case studies and testimonials is going to be important. Amiables want personal contact. So if they don't build a one-to-one relationship with you or your resellers, they're unlikely to buy. So knowing what's important to your client is vital. Giving an amiable lots of technical data is unlikely to impress them very much, and similar lots of chat not backed up with hard facts won't get you very far with an analytical. In reality, most people are a mixture of types, but successful salespeople adapt their approach depending on their customers' buying behaviour. Buying persona takes this further to find the best way to address the target customers by understanding and anticipating their individual business issues and drivers with a shared vocabulary. And then this will enable you to have discussions using the customer's own phraseology. So we've talked about the type of information that you might want and how you distill that from very broad style conversation down to more quantified approach. But once the data is collected, it needs to be distilled into a usable format. And things like segmentation and cluster analysis are a good way of doing that, so that you can end up with a manageable number of groups with like-minded characteristics. And here is a summary of 3 different groups that come from an anonymized project. There were more groups than this. This is just an example of 3 of them that show how personal characteristics are brought together with business factors to create target groups. So one group, which we labelled technical savvy decision makers, these were very focused on financial issues and increasing productivity, and were very interested in new technology. They tend to be more senior and in specific sectors, and they want to see demonstrations on return on investment. So for them, return on investment tools could be really important. Poor-time sophisticates, on the other hand, are very concerned about workflow. Lack of time is their biggest issue, and so they need to see lots of case studies and testimonials that would demonstrate time savings. And the third group were defined as proficient 3D users. These were very skilled users who were familiar with lots of different sorts of software, and they were more interested about knowing what their competitors were doing so that they could ultimately beat them. So again, they want case studies and testimonials, but they need to be focused on winning new business and not so much increased productivity. So you can see with just 3 examples how developing personas can really help in targeting marketing and sales communications that speak to the heart of your clients in their own language. We'll share a few more examples with you later. And I'm now going to hand over to Nicola, who will continue by looking at buyer persona templates.
Thanks, Sue. Many companies offer free templates to help to develop a buyer persona, and we found from project experience that using a consistent template really helps to clearly identify similarities and also differences between the different personas. Once you start to have a good number of personas, it's important to prevent duplication. We worked with one particular client, for example, who developed a really good naming convention to describe personas, but actually they managed to essentially have the same buyer personas with a number of different names. And I think there the issue is really not having a consistent template so you could easily compare the different personas. From a practical perspective, it often helps, I think, to have a photograph of the persona. It's often good to visualize the persona. You tend to remember the persona and the attributes of that persona. It's also good to have a quotation that really encapsulates the persona, and a brief summary of the role and the marketing messages that might appeal to that persona. As Sue mentioned, things like background, education, age, use of social media, membership associations, they're all nice to have. But the real area of focus, and here we're showing on the red-orange box at the bottom, are things like goals, pain points, challenges, and the purchasing decision process. And it's often really helpful to have them in a specific location on the template, just for ease of reference. I've already described how we've developed some personas, but also how we've used personas for a number of client projects. And this project was initiated by a software vendor who'd already conducted some ethnographic research to obtain some initial descriptions of key personas in the manufacturing sector. This research had already involved specialist ethnographic researchers, and they'd shadowed a number of customers to see them at work in their own environment. Our client was really looking to disrupt the market with a new software solution and really wanted to understand the behaviours of end users, how they engage with technology, both at work and at home, and how they worked on a daily basis. They were interested in things like the tools that they used, the workflow, how they chose suppliers. And we developed a very detailed understanding of this, and it was originally based on that initial persona. We use those personas to recruit the target participants in focus groups, both in the USA and the UK, to understand their response to some new concepts. And we identified 3 groups of challenges, which were broadly categorized as social, economic, and technology related. This proved to be really useful, and based on that and their response to the new concepts and the messages that our client had developed, they were able to revise their product strategy at a very early stage. In order to enhance the initial buyer persona descriptions, we also conducted a quantitative study with about 280 people across 4 countries. And this information was really useful to help to enhance the original persona based on the ethnographic research. Here we're showing an example of cluster analysis, and you can see it being anonymized, and the results of a quantitative study. In addition to job titles and functions, we analysed the data using cluster analysis to identify groups of characteristics. And the 3 groups were given the descriptions of tech-savvy information consumer, educated technology explorer, and content traditionalist. And you can see that the tech-savvy information consumer is typically in a number of industry sectors. We call them A and B here, just to anonymise them. And they were using things like Google Docs and YouTube. And they were really more likely to respond to social media, whereas the content traditionalist, on the right-hand side, was found across all industry sectors, but they were unlikely to be using a computer at home. And they really relied on trade shows and events to obtain information about new products. And this group really wouldn't respond at all to social media-based marketing campaigns because they just don't use social media. So when using cluster analysis, it also helps to understand the proportion of the market that falls into a particular cluster. And this can be very useful when making decisions on the type of marketing approach and also the marketing budget to maximise return on investment. This is an example of one of the personas that was developed for the same project, and again, it's been anonymised. In this case, it was for a general manager, and you can see at the top in a green short synopsis, and there's a quotation which really encapsulates the persona. In this case, we describe it as my focus is productivity and finding new customers. There's some background on age and education in the blue box, and the proportion of this persona that had achieved, for example, a degree-level education. In the orange box, you can see that they're likely to have a desktop and a laptop at home, but they know very little about social media. And in the yellow box at the bottom, you can see that they're likely to have a desktop. Their main frustrations are complexity of CAM programming, and a real pain point is finding experienced CAM programmers. This was really useful for our clients to communicate about as their new solution could potentially be used effectively by much less experienced staff, and there was a real short learning curve attached to the new software. Another practical way of using buyer personas is in relation to user experience research. And this is really where we're trying to understand users' emotions and attitudes about using a particular product, system or service. And one leading software vendor that we work with on a regular basis has developed a list of about 60 personas, and each has a 1 to 2 page description. Now, Business Advantage regularly recruits participants to take part in that user experience. And we've done this for a number of clients, and we use the buyer persona really as the starting point. Based on that persona description, and we obviously have a short discussion with the project lead, but we're able to create a screening questionnaire quite quickly and recruit participants for things like customer site visits, laboratory tests, and online discussions. And we've developed an automated system that really hinges on that persona description. And this enables us to recruit participants based on specific criteria. We then identify potential targets from our databases. We screen them to ensure they meet the criteria, and then we invite them to participate. They're also asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement, and we confirm the appointment with them just before the research session. And finally, we also provide the incentives to thank participants for their time. And we've now actually completed around 50 recruitment projects across a number of clients, and we've organised over 400 research sessions with both our clients, customers, and competitive product users. And before moving on to our next speaker, it's just worth pointing out some of the common mistakes or pitfalls of developing buyer personas. And here we've identified 6. The first really is not discovering profound insight. And this can really be avoided by good preparation and the design of a really good discussion guide or questionnaire to make sure that you're really asking the right questions. Building too many personas is also a common mistake, and as mentioned, we've seen examples where clients have duplicated personas just by giving them different names. So having a template that enables each comparison can really help here. Pain points, which are back to different product capabilities, and what I mean here is not prompting, thereby allowing new ideas to emerge. I think it's very easy for marketers and sales professionals to have preconceived ideas about pain points. Really, it works best if you allow the data to tell its own story. If you just fit your preconceptions of pain points to justify the development of the product, you really don't need to be surprised if no one actually buys that product. And we have had some clients that have done exactly that. This ties well into not overcoming your own biases. What we mean by this is you need to be open to new ideas. Similarly, creating buyer persona checklists is a common mistake. Whilst you can have a list of common questions, the real insight comes from in-depth conversations, and it does depend on budget, but we'd always recommend a hybrid approach to get the best results. Finally, keeping buyer personas up to date, and especially in the technology sector, is really important. So we'd recommend doing a small number of check-in interviews with a few previous or new interviews every 6 to 12 months. I'd now like to hand over to Natalie Mainland, who's our guest speaker for today.
Thank you, Nicola. So as Nicola said, my name is Natalie Mainland, and I've worked with Business Advantage in several different roles now at different companies over the last few years. But when I commissioned this particular buyer persona research we're going to talk about here, I was the senior manager for small business strategy and development at Autodesk. And I think, as many of you know, Autodesk is the leading developer of CAD products, namely AutoCAD and other computer-aided design software tools, particularly for the architecture, engineering, and construction industries, as well as the manufacturing industries. So what was our business challenge, and really what were we looking to accomplish with this research? Well, at my role on the very small business team, we had a really significant goal of increasing Autodesk's growth rate within this very small business market. So when we commissioned the buyer persona research from Business Advantage, we were really trying to understand the similarities, but also the differences among this very large market of small businesses, and trying to take a look at, and understand how they differed within the industries that we served, different countries and different cultures in which Autodesk does business. And so we selected Business Advantage really because they had a long-term and kind of proven track record in the CAD/CAM industry, and they were also an Autodesk market research partner. And I think by the time that I left Autodesk, Business Advantage had done kind of over 250 market research projects for Autodesk. So I knew their work, and I knew that they thoroughly understood our business and our markets. So what did we want to know? Really, in order to speak more effectively to our small business customers, we needed to gain a much deeper understanding of these buyers. I wanted to know who they are, their pain points, what their motivations were, how they like to be reached and communicated with, what their lifestyle is like, who their trusted advisors are. And all of this would enable us to really speak to them so that they would hear our message.
And by focusing on really understanding our customers, I knew we'd be able to kind of help prevent that normal tendency of marketing campaigns sometimes to be a little bit too broad. And I think we all know that better targeting equals more focused and, ultimately more successful marketing. So that was the goal behind conducting this research. In terms of the results, the project, that we conducted here had to be done on an incredibly tight time frame. So I think we contracted with Business Advantage, and within a week or two, they were interviewing about 400 people, customers, new prospects across multiple countries and multiple languages. And I think they completed the interview process in about 3 weeks. And again, we covered North America and multiple countries within EMEA with this research. So the results really that both validated what we kind of expected or thought about our very small business clients. So for example, I think globally, they're pressed for time, they wear many hats, they needed to tightly manage costs, again, because they are such small businesses. But we really started to uncover and learn some interesting differences between the industries that these clients were in, as well as the countries they were located in. So we saw some significant differences with respect to how clients work with their resellers and their expectations for their relationship with their resellers. Even between countries in EMEA, we saw this, and this was useful information for our reseller partners as well as our channel managers, to be able to use in their strategies and their outreach. So we also gained some pretty useful competitive insights on the software tools that our very small business clients were using. We saw kind of the expected major competitors, but we also gained a lot more information about how they use often, smaller, often ignored competitors, even open source tools. So this gave us a better perspective in terms of crafting our message to them. And so in the final presentation to us, Business Advantage, they did some innovative work with cluster analysis that gave us some interesting insights, but the fundamental persona definition was really the key deliverable that we got and what was useful for us as part of this research project. They identified 6 different distinct personas kind of aligned by industry, and this was incredibly useful in informing our campaign team. Not only educating them, but in helping them craft, the appropriate kind of campaign message and tactics to these various audiences. And, the other area that this was particularly useful for us is at the time we were kind of in the early stages of our go-to-market strategy for a new cloud-based design tool in the manufacturing industry. And so again, this research was very useful in helping us really hone in and craft that early message to them. So with that, I'll kind of leave you with one final thought here. I'm speaking with you today because Business Advantage did a really great job for us and impressed us with their ability and professionalism. And, I've already used them in other positions that I've been in and recommended them to others. So I'm happy to serve as a reference for the work that they do. So with that, I will hand it over to, I think it's Nicola again.
It is. Thank you, Natalie, for your contribution. We really appreciate it. Just to round up, we've created a form of checklist really to assist with successful buyer persona development. And as you mentioned initially, at the start of the process, it's really important to talk to sales personnel to get some initial insight into who are the best people to talk to. We'd also recommend that you identify and agree your target audience. Ideally, you want a mixture of existing customers, prospects, and also competitive users. Start the research process with qualitative research. So this is in-depth face-to-face interviews, could be shadowing participants in their workplace for a period of time. And it helps to have a discussion guide here to provide some structure to the conversation. But real insight comes from deep conversations where the researcher probes to gain real detail on the reasons behind the behaviour. Background information is useful for the main focus, but should be But the main focus should really be establishing goals, pain points, frustrations, and also the decision-making processes used within an organisation. So try to leave marketing and sales preconceptions at home and be conscious of potential bias. We'd always recommend that personas are enhanced with discussions with larger groups, and then these could be online or face-to-face focus groups. They often work well, or indeed quantitative research to provide some more robust numbers. This is a very good way we find to validate the personas, and using cluster analysis can also be a really useful tool here. Also, agree on a standard template or format for the personas, and finally revisit and revise the personas on a regular basis. And now I'd like to hand back to Bill Gordon, who will share some of your questions.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Super. Well, thank you, everyone. Well, that's the wrap on kind of the formal presentation portion. And but just before we move into the question and answer session, I promise to show you the results of the two polls. So the first one is, have you developed buyer personas within your organization? And just over 2/3 of you have, about a quarter have not, and a few of you weren't certain if your organizations had developed them yet. So that was interesting. And then the second question was about your biggest challenges. I thought this was very interesting. With developing buyer personas. So 60%, just too much research required to do it correctly. Hopefully, we're certainly hoping that today's session may have given you some ideas about where to start, because it can seem like a somewhat overwhelming task at times, but some good ideas on where to start, some templates and some checklists to get started with. And certainly this is an area that the Business Advantage can support you in, either on a small portion of the research that needs to be done, or on the full development process for buyer personas. Also on this poll, about 30% of you just not enough time, and then 10% not sure it was worth the time. So hopefully we've addressed some of those questions about how clients that we work with and people such as Natalie and Autodesk and other organizations we work with have found value in their buyer personas. So I'd now like to, one other thing just before I move to Q&A is at the end of today's webinar, when you sign off, we will be a brief, simple poll will pop up, and if you wouldn't mind, please just taking literally 1 minute to let us know what you valued about today's session, and how we can do it better in our webinars in the future to better address your needs and make sure we bring maximum value. We do review every comment, and if you have any questions, we always follow up on those. So now I'd like to open for question and answers. Natalie, unfortunately, did have to drop off for an executive management meeting. But if you have any questions for Natalie, please do let us know. Still ask them, and we will get answers back to you from Natalie following today's session. So you can enter your questions into the chat question pane on the right-hand side of your screen if you have any. So if anyone has any questions, all right, thank you. So one question here, how long does it take to do buyer persona research? Sue or Nicola, any answers on that?
It varies, and obviously it depends how many different phases or stages. If you were going to do ethnographics followed up with some depth interviews or focus groups and then a quantitative study, you're probably talking about an 8 to 12 week period to do all of that. But if you were going to only do some of those elements because you already had insights from elsewhere, then it could be turned around quicker than that. But yeah, I mean, for the full project, you're probably talking about 8 to 12 weeks. And it will also depend on how many geographies you're covering as well. But that would be broadly a timescale to bear in mind.
Super. Thanks, Sue. Anna, understood. So thank you. If you do have any questions, Anna, feel free to shout them out. Valerie's asking, how many people do you need to interview to get good results, and what would be an average budget for such a research? So the budget may be a tough one to get into depending on scope and breadth and countries and such, but we can come back to you on that one, Valerie, certainly. But in terms of the how many people need to be interviewed to get results, Nicola or Sue, do you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, budget's a difficult one to sort of come off the top of our head. To rather come back to that. I mean, broadly, I don't know, just talking to Nicola, in terms of budget, something 20,000 sterling upwards, depending. But I mean, it varies. It could be less if you're doing smaller amounts, so difficult to really give you a figure there. In terms of number of samples, you may want to do maybe 4 to 6 sort of ethnographic observations, again depending on how many sectors you're covering, how many geographies you're covering, but I would think that would be around the number that you might be looking at, obviously being very careful about how you structured those and who you chose. If you were then going to do focus groups, you would do maybe 2, perhaps 4, but again that would depend on geographies, sectors and so on. And then when it comes to more quantitative figures, we would normally say per geography or per sector you'd be looking at 30 to 50 interviews in each of those. I mean, that's been done very successfully via web surveys in the past, which means that you can actually perhaps have much bigger samples very cost effectively at that stage. If you're doing telephone interviews, you obviously need to think much more about the budget implications of that. And again, if you were doing depth interviews or triads and dyads, you'd be talking in terms of numbers of perhaps 4 to 6, again, depending on sectors and geographies, and multiply up from there. If you would start probably with a discussion group, perhaps with the sales team, or a face-to-face meeting where you'd have everybody together. So that might only require one meeting, which could be held sort of online and could be global. It's very much a bespoke approach, and we would really listen to whatever your needs were and then develop the best way forward from there.
Thanks, Sue. Tim was wondering, how do buyer personas work across countries? So, for example, between France and the USA, would there be different personas, or do personas cross borders?
Well, most of the projects we've done are global, and actually we would usually use country as one of the variables that we're inputting into it. So, for example, we would usually try and keep a common framework for all of the geographies, but then at the analysis stage could be when we see some major differences by country. So, for example, I can think of one project quite clearly where when we were looking at sort of the approach people wanted with their marketing tools in Germany, they were still quite traditionalist, and that was one of the things that came out in the cluster and segmentation, that it was the German market that predominantly was still very interested in brochures or what have you. And whereas in, I think it was Korea and Italy, we saw very strongly they were much more into having social media and or internet-based tools, and weren't interested in the slightest in any hard copy. So what I would say is that you would keep the same template initially in terms of the way that you were approaching it, but the outcomes could be different by country.
Very good. Thank you, Sue. And got just a couple more here, but if anyone wants to put in any more questions, please feel free to add those in. And And Valerie, by the way, if you wanted to follow up with any more detail on that question, happy to do that afterwards as well. Mike was just asking, can buyer personas be developed for any industry or market? You talked a lot today about CAM and Autodesk, but do these apply for any industry or market?
Yes. Yeah, any industry or market.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Any other questions before we wrap up today? And if you'd like to, our contact details are up here on the screen. Please feel free to reach out after today's session to myself, Bill Gordon, or to our CEO, Chris Turner. I didn't mention that I'm based in our U.S. office in the San Francisco Bay Area, and Chris is traveling in the U.S. frequently, but is based out of our UK headquarters office. I don't see any other questions coming through, but please, again, do feel free to follow up afterwards. I'd like to thank you all very much for taking the time to be with us today. I hope we brought some of the value that you were looking for today. And if you would, please give us your honest appraisal just for a minute or two in the follow-up questions that will come up at the end of today's webinar. Thank you very much, and I wish you all a wonderful